recording. Just to be in isolation. And then we make it larger. Alright, so we'll start. Good morning again, everybody. The class is better packed than the Friday class. Anywho, we'll start with our lesson, and our unit is on teaching listening. But before we talk, alright, what is involved in listening? I think somebody was trying to say something. Alright, go ahead, I'm listening. Anyways, we can talk about that at the end of the lesson, alright? So we have to cover as much as we can today. Alright, when it comes to listening, listening is not just about hearing. Listening is so much more than just being there and hearing. Listening is an interactive process that involves both linguistics and cognitive processes. So it's like you have to use your language and you also have to use your thinking capacity. Active listening involves both one way, which is called the one participatory context, listening context, or it could be a two-way. So one way is like only one person listening, but then when it's two-way, it's interactive. It's like somebody's listening and then they have to speak, listening and speaking. Do you understand? So that's what we mean by that. So it's an active process, even if it's a one-way, whereby when somebody is listening, there is still that process of like cognitive and linguistic ability or processes that needs to be involved in that listening task. And then there are suggested 6 sub-skills of active listening. So what do we have as sub-skills of active listening? So we need to know what is active listening because we have to train our learners on how to actively listen. So number 1 is showing interest and building empathy through body language and back channeling. So back channeling is like involving like showing that you are listening and then saying things like, okay, what do you mean? So those are what we call back channeling. And then number 2 is echoing. Echoing is saying what somebody has said. It's more like repeating when somebody says something to you and then repeating that to the person. Clarifying, so you need to ask clarification, or it could also involve number 4, paraphrasing, restating what the person say in other words. Commenting, so giving your comment on what had been said, and questioning. So all these tasks are very important when it comes to active listening, because sometimes you say, somebody is listening, but in actuality they are not listening. So for them to actively listen, they have to be involved in all these types of steps, sub-skills. Excuse me. What are the challenges then that comes with teaching listening? We are going to look at some of the challenges, all right? And especially for learners, listening presents a challenge for a variety of reasons. Among the following, which are amongst the following that are stated here. These are not the only ones, but these are just some of the examples of situations that causes challenges when the learners are listening. So listening involves multiple modes. So listening involves the interpersonal, interpretative modes of communication. It requires the listener to assume either to resume or assume rather a participative role in a face-to-face conversation, or a non-participative role in listening to other people when other people, like for example, they speak or they listen. So it's not always like, okay, you are just there as a listener, but it could also mean that somebody needs to be interactive. So yeah, and then this, when they take multiple modes, it can be challenging to be able to listen, process whatever is said, and then responding. That could be challenging, all right? And then next, listening involves all variety of language. So in addition to listening to lectures and presentation in an academic or formal setting, learners have also to partake or listen to exchanges that involve various levels of colloquialism. So colloquialism here, we're talking about the type of language type or language style that is involved in whatever that they are listening to. So for example, when somebody is presenting from the education field, they have they could be like, they could have a certain way of expressing themselves, right? And that could be influenced by the education that they have gotten, for example, or just in naturally like the language that is involved in language teaching. Because when somebody is from, let's say, the medical field, they have a way of expressing themselves, and the language that they use, the vocabulary that they use, the style that they use might be a little bit different. And then again, a colloquialism, when you're talking to a native speaker, like somebody who is, let's say, somebody from even Namibia, but then all they know, all they have used all their lives, they are from an English-speaking family, then the way they express themselves could be a little bit different from somebody who is, let's say, from a village and they don't use English as much. Do you understand? So the type of language and vocabulary and styles and expressions that people use, all that can pose as a challenge when the learners are not aware, or they are not have not been exposed to that type of expressions that they are presented with. And then next, listening involves altered and reduced language forms. So in addition to dealing with vocabulary and structures of language, as we have just spoken from the previous point, the learners also need to learn to comprehend reduced forms of language. So for example, when somebody say, I want to go, or if somebody just says, just a sec, if they are not exposed to that, when language is reduced, right? So here you know that it says that I want to go. Let's say they are exposed to formal language and not so much of informal language, then obviously that could also cause problems. Sec, they might not know what a sec means, and then that could also pose difficulties. And then listening involves a variable rates of delivery. So unlike reading text that is at the learner's control, listening text is constantly moving and at variable speeds that often cannot be controlled by the listeners. So it's like sometimes it just depends on the type of person who's speaking, like the speed that they use naturally. Are they fast speakers? Are they slow speakers? What type of speakers are they? And then if it's a fast speaker and it's a text where the fast speaker is communicating or presenting or whatever that they are doing, involving spoken language, then that the learners have really no control over, unless maybe, let's say, if they are watching YouTube, when they have control over the speed, it's a different situation. But then when they don't have control over it, then obviously they might, let's say in an examination or a test, there they have no control over that. Or if somebody is speaking face to face, they have no control over the speed that the person is speaking, unless maybe you ask them to speak slowly, but then it could be annoying again to ask somebody that, or they could be shy to ask somebody to speak slowly. But then in situations where they are listening to, let's say, a YouTube video, they have control, because they can control, they can change the speed, making it slower or making it faster if somebody is speaking slowly. Because of all these factors, listening activities often create high levels of anxiety and stress among learners that can interfere with their comprehension. So which means, again, already naturally this skill can be daunting for the learners, and then when it because of that, it causes anxiety and stress. And when somebody is under stress or under anxiety, they don't perform as well. So which means it could inhibit their comprehension. So for teachers as well, addressing listening in the classroom poses some challenges. Not only learners have issues when it comes to listening, but also teachers can also face some challenges, and then we'll look at some of those for them. Let's just address a few of them. So one of them, if somebody is not trained well enough on how to teach listening in itself, then they will face some challenges. And also, not only that, some other challenges that they may face is depending on the number of students that they are teaching, not knowing, let's say, how to address whatever issues that the learners may be facing let's say in their listening. Not just, okay, for instance, if you are not aware of like what are some of the challenges that learners can face, then obviously those issues will not be addressed in the lesson to help the learners. And then 3, when the teacher himself or herself is not confident when it comes to expressing themselves, do you understand? Or they are just not equipped enough to know what listening is involved, then obviously that in itself will also cause some challenges. Those are just a few of them. And 2, like the issues that the learners are facing here, that could also be a challenge that the teacher himself or herself could be facing. So obviously, if a teacher is challenged by the issues that the learners are faced with, then obviously that teacher won't be able to help the learners themselves as well. All right, moving on. Now we are going to look at some 7 principles for teaching listening. So what should you consider when it comes to teaching listening? But before we go on to that topic, do you have questions so far? Any questions? No? All right, we are moving on. So first one, the first principle that we have is teach the students both the bottom-up and top-down processing. I know we've spoken a lot about bottom-up and top-down, but let's look at it again in the context of listening. So successful listeners use both bottom-up and top-down processing. And it's the same with reading, it's the same with writing, it's the same with speaking. The person who uses both the bottom-up and top-down processing is the one who is always considered successful because they know how to process the language in both ways. So the bottom-up processing refers to the use of incoming data as a source of information about the meaning of the message. So from this perspective, the process of comprehension begins with the message received. All right, so you take on the message that is received, which is analyzed at successive levels of organization. So here we're talking about when you receive the language, you analyze the language based on the sound, the words, the clauses, and the sentences until the intended meaning is arrived. So which means that the meaning of whatever language that is being processed is processed from the bottom up, which means starting with the sound, words, clauses, sentences at that level. All right, so that's what it involves in bottom up. And then comprehension is thus viewed as the process of decoding. So for example, bottom up process in listening include the following. So for example, scan the input to identify the familiar lexical items. So the word lexical items, so here let's say the word. And then 2, segmenting the stream of speech into grammatical constituencies. So whatever that is presented to you, then you segment them, like which one is the noun phrase, verb phrase, and then noun phrase, verb phrase, and maybe adjectival adverb phrase. Do you understand? So you segment them in portions that are meaningful in terms of the grammar. All right, so that's just an example. And then using phonological cues to identify the information, focusing on the utterances. And then 4, using the grammatical cues to organize the input into constituents. For example, in order to recognize the book which I lent you. So it's like, so you getting grammatical cues to help you recognize what is being said. All right, so the book, so which book are they talking about is the one that is I lent you. So things like that. In other words, bottom up is really just focusing at the sentence level. All right, and the meaning that they are processing is the one that is stated exactly at the sentence level. All right, and then we'll see how it is differentiated with the top-down processing. On the other hand, so the top-down processing refers to the use of background knowledge in understanding the meaning of the message. Background knowledge may take several forms. It may be previous knowledge about the topic of discourse, or it may be situational or contextual knowledge, or it may be knowledge stored in a long-term memory in the form of schemata scripts. So plans about the overall structure of the events and relationship between them. So in other words, I mean, we have already spoken about this, like what is top-down. Top-down is really focusing on the experiences that the learners have had with language itself, and talking about background knowledge, using background knowledge, not only the information that is stated, but also referring to the experiences that they have had. And we have seen a number of examples in previous lessons, right? And then top-down processing involves drawing on background knowledge to help make sense of what we are listening to. So how do we do this? Psychologists say that we do it by drawing on schemata. Schemata are like mental movie scripts that we build up from an early childhood. And then when we learn, we constantly adjust our pre-existing schemata and add on new ones. I think you understand that, right? And I think in your other English language classes, I can't even think of which one exactly from the humanities that talks about schemata. So it's like the knowledge as a human being. It's like your mind is like a computer, and then it has compartments where you store information. So the more experienced you become, whatever that you're exposed to, in some ways it adds to your schemata. Like your world is changed by the experiences and the exposure that you get. And then the more you expose yourself to so much more, let's say through reading, watching series, watching documentaries, then obviously you are building onto your schemata. Just an example. And then that's how now you build on your background knowledge. And then next we are going to look at incorporating a range of text types into your listening lessons. And then I think you can also I think it's stated in the syllabus as well on exposing the learners into different texts. This is not only for listening, even for reading. They say that you should expose the learners to different type of text. In writing, they should write different types of text. All right, like they should different type of writing. And then we have got, let's say, they can write essay, reports. Do you understand? Blogs, journals. They can do all that within the lesson. All right, so Andrea is asking if I'm muted. Can you hear me? I hope you can. God. Oh, okay. And I hope it's not just Soyin who can hear me. Other people can also. Yes, you can hear me. All right. So which means I'm not muted. Awesome. And then we are moving on to the explanation. So learners need to be exposed to a wide range of text types, including monologues to dialogues, from casual conversation in which people are socializing, for example, to interaction in which the speaker is trying to obtain goods and services. It's like, when you get, let's say, to an office and you want information, that could be not offices really. Okay, let's say in a shop, for instance, you don't always have formal conversation, whatever conversation that happens when you want to buy something, for instance, that is like the goods and services. And then they should have the opportunity to watch all types of television shows, from sitcoms. So sitcoms are like series. I don't know. Have you watched Friends? The sitcom Friends? It's on Netflix. It's streaming on Netflix now. And then not only that, so okay, examples of sitcoms. These are more like series, basically, right? Different kind of series that they can show. And then to news, all right? Exactly. Big Bang Theory, yes, that's also an example of sitcom. Public announcement, recorded telephone conversation, telephone messages, advertisement, and so on. And then you see that in the syllabus, you see that these are the different types of listening that happens, and we need to teach our learners, expose our learners, and prepare them not only for real life but also for the examination as well. Out of class, learners can work on their listening through enormous range of texts available through the internet. So, for example, on YouTube, TED Talks. Even on Instagram now they have got, I don't know, reels also. But then as long as they are longer, shorter ones are also good. Oh yeah, they call it the What do they call this? That looks, yes, Instagram TV. Absolutely. Oh, you are the one. So it just shows that I don't use Instagram as much. So, things like that. And then these have been especially recorded to be more comprehensive to second language speakers. All right. Yeah, thank you so much for that. So as long as it's made in such a way that language learners can use it, and I mean for our students, I feel like they can listen to anything and everything basically. So news, you can record news, or you can even get it from YouTube, like news that happens on NBC or whatever news channel that you use, and then you show it in the classroom. Next. All right, the next principle is incorporate a range of pedagogical and real-world tasks into the lessons. So what do we mean by that? What we mean exactly is that in addition to text authenticity, there is a task authenticity. Again, in deciding whether or not the task is authentic, we need to take our bearing from the real world outside the classroom and ask ourselves, is this something that people do outside the classroom? So when you talk about authenticity, it's like how relatable, how closely relatable is that to what people speak or use language outside the classroom, like in real life. So the more closer the activity is to the real life or real world communication, the authentic this task can be considered. Do you understand? So in general, in real world, people do not listen to an answer machine and complete a set of true or false questions. So that is not a real life situation. But then if the message is more of, a real message that has been recorded, then it could be considered as authentic. But you should know that in real life, though, we don't do true or false questions or fill in the gap. No. You listen to the message, you take the message, make notes, and then leave a message for another person. Do you understand? Or call the person, and then address whatever question or whatever they have included in their message that they've left you with. Right. There is a place for non-authentic listening text in the language classroom. The same point applies to the tasks. So there may be a place for true or false questions. I mean, yes, there will be. How do you know that the learners are listening or not? It's through the activities that you give them. All right. And then, but there should also be tasks that enables learners to rehearse in the classroom, the sort of things that they need to do outside the classroom. So we need to, I feel like for the most part, what we deal with, what we tackle in the classroom is what happens in the real world. So I think for the most part, but again, when you get to schools, I feel like we also have a lot of activities that are really inauthentic, just for the sake of teaching listening that we use. But consider using real life activities as well. Real world listening. Listening will involve production, obviously. So how do you know that the person is listening? Is by producing something to show that they are listening and they understood what they were listening. Okay, but the focus of a listening lesson or listening segment within a lesson that includes other skills should be mainly on listening, not on speaking or writing. Oh, okay, I understand. So again, if it's a listening lesson, don't let it be overrun by other skills. So we should include as much listening as possible. And I think something that we haven't discussed is that sometimes listening is not really focused on much in our lessons. We tend to focus on other things, like on skills more like, let's say, writing, more on reading, for instance. But then when it comes to listening and speaking, we kind of, speaking, do we as much? But we don't really talk about how to speak appropriately. We don't teach our learners the strategies of speaking well. Do you understand? But then the most that I know that we focus on a lot is reading and writing. And then within the reading and writing, especially in the writing, we focus on the grammar. and we don't even focus much on the vocabulary. So we need to focus on all these skills because they are all important, right? And then, however, we can only evaluate whether the learner has understood a listening text by getting them to do something, that is through production of one kind or the other, either by speaking or writing, for instance. This might involve answering questions either orally or in writing, taking a telephone message, and so on. Or the response may be nonverbal, which is true because when we are speaking, we don't always have to say something, our body language, all right? We use nonverbal communication. So listening to a set of instruction and assembling a toy or a game could be one of them. So which means they are not saying anything, but they are putting together something. Or even pictures. So listening and drawing a picture could be one. Or they could be a set of pictures, number of them, and then when they listen, they put it in a certain order. That's also another way of dealing with listening and showing that they are listening or participating. Non-verbal communication is like nodding, do you understand? Using facial expressions, those are also non-verbal communication. The richer the variety of tasks, the more interesting the listening lessons will be for students and for you too as a teacher. Because if you don't use a variety of activities when it comes to listening, then it becomes very boring or tedious when you just use the same type of activity over and over and over without really changing it up. You have a variety of activities you can use in the lesson. Next, we are going to talk about incorporating strategy training in the teaching, in your teaching. For instance, for instance, Noonan has stressed the importance of matching up our responses for listening with the type of oral text we are listening to, and listen for key information and so on. The purpose is paramount. Not just what you are listening to, but also what you are listening for. What are you listening for exactly? Are you listening to get information? Are you listening to complete a certain task? Do you understand? All that is what you have to concentrate on. It's important to include learners' strategy training to the language teaching. So here we have got a number of strategies that you can include in your class as strategy training, or the strategies that you need to teach your learners when it comes to listening. 1, we have got prediction. Effective listeners think about what will happen, what they will hear. All right, so that is now predicting what is going to happen. Inferring is useful for learners to listen between the lines. As we know, you have to infer at times. Things are not always stated out clearly, all right, and straightforward. So they have to read between the lines. And then next, monitoring. A good listener notices what they do or don't understand. So always listening. Okay, did I understand what this person is saying? How much of it do I understand? If I am to ask a question, what part of what they've said I have not understood? All right, that's where now clarification comes in. Efficient listener asks questions. What does mean? You mean give feedback? I don't understand yet. To the speaker, do you understand? You just don't sit there and pretend that you are listening when you are not listening, or when the learner is not listening. Oh, you yourself too. This is strategy that you need to know. And next, what do we have? Responding. Learners react to what they hear, so there's some sort of response that they do. So if they, for example, if they hear bad news, how do they respond? If they hear exciting news, how do they respond? If they are asked a question, how do they respond? If they are asked something that is not comfortable, for instance, then they have to give some sort of response. Do you understand? And then evaluating, they check on how well they have understood. So evaluating, so how much they have understood, they have to ask themselves that as well. And then I think this one in a way is related to monitor. And then next, focus both fluency and accuracy depending on your objective. So what do we mean by that? So we need to bear in mind a spectrum of learners' needs, from language-based focus on accuracy to message-based focus on interaction, meaning, and fluency. So you just don't, so fluency and accuracy, you just don't, let's say, focus on students saying correct sentences only, saying correct vocabulary, correct. No, sometimes you also need to focus on fluency, whereby they need to, fluency comes when the focus is on them producing language that is meaningful, that is understandable. So for example, if the learner can speak, utter a number of phrases and sentences, but they might not be grammatically correct, but you understood what they mean, and that is your focus. So which means fluency is your focus on in the classroom. Then you don't have to be bogged down by, if they say a word, for instance, in an incorrect way, but it does not affect the meaning of what they are saying, then you don't have to focus on that word much. So it just depends on what you are focusing on. When, for example, when you do a jigsaw group technique, play a game, or discuss solution to the environmental crisis, make sure that your tasks have linguistic, so language-based objectives, and seize the opportunity to help students to perceive and use the building block of language. So for example, even if they are playing a game, I know playing a game, for instance, could seem to be like, as long as they are communicating and finishing the game, do you understand, if that's the objective, or doing a jigsaw activity, then maybe you may want to not focus so much on grammar, but focusing on grammar on certain aspects, especially the ones that may impede some sort of communication, or you think that is really necessary for the learners to know how to use, then focus on that. If they are using an expression in the wrong way, then of course you can do that. Or you can even give the learner certain language that they can use in the game, for example, certain language that you want them to focus on to use in the game, or whatever activity that they are doing that is language based, not just fluency. At the same time, don't bore your students with repetitious drills. All right, it's noted above, make any drilling you do as meaningful as possible. Don't just say, set up some drills, so which means it's like phrases that the learners need to repeat over and over, but then it's not very meaningful. It should be created in such a way that is meaningful in context, and then they are meaningful. And next, provide appropriate feedback. So what do you mean by that? So in the context of L2 learning, so the context like ours in Namibia, for instance, our learners may get feedback outside the classroom. Do you understand? So for example, if they meet with somebody who's very fluent in language, in language, they are just certain people. They are not teachers. But then when somebody makes a mistake or makes an error, they are confident enough, or they will definitely correct the person. So learners may get feedback outside the classroom by people who may correct them. Some parents do correct their kids when they make mistakes in their expressions. So it's possible that they get feedback from outside the classroom. But even in such positions, even in such contexts, we teachers, you as a teacher, you still need to give your learners some sort of feedback that is necessary for them. It is important that you take advantage of your knowledge on the L2 to inject the kinds of feedback that are appropriate for the moment, and that will help the students notice elements of language that they need to work on. For example, when you notice that, there are, they are listening, okay, obviously it's listening. And how do you know that the learner is listening? Is by producing something. So in their production, when you see that they make certain mistakes, that's when now you give them the feedback that is necessary. All right. And then if you notice that the learner struggle with some sort or some type of listening activity, then in a context like that, you give them some sort of feedback, like what strategies they need to kind of consider for them to become better when it comes to to that type of activities, like for them to listen better and effectively. All right. That's just an example to base it on the listening provide. All right, before we go on, I think these 3 phases of teaching listening is something that we are going to cover in the next lesson.